In a small Cumbrian town, there lived a blacksmith who experienced one of the most extreme periods of change that Britain's ever seen. Through a combination of skill, flexibility, and a great deal of charm, he managed to navigate this change and become known across the British Isles. Today, I'm walking from Lancaster to Kirkby Lonsdale, the place he called home. This is his story of survival, even when the world changed around him. In order to understand the story of our protagonist today, you must first understand the world in which he was born. The year, 1893. The place, Kirkby Lonsdale, a small market town on the southern border of Cumbria, in the valley of the River Lune. While recently the Industrial Revolution had swept across England, completely reorganising the economy of the country and changing the lives of its citizens, it had largely left Kirkby Lonsdale untouched. Life continued here much as it had done for many a long century, the lives of ordinary people governed primarily by the whims of wealthy landowners, such as the Benticks of Underley Hall, or the Paget Tomlinsons who lived in the local house known as the Mansion. They employed huge swathes of people to work their farms and to serve in their houses. Even those not directly employed by the landowners were still somewhat in their orbit. The skills of the wheelwright, the saddler, the smith and the woodturner allowed this rural economy to function and this way of life to continue. It was into this world that Jonty Wilson was born, the eldest of 10 siblings. Jonty's family, like many in the area, often had to rely on what the countryside could provide to support themselves. It was not uncommon when there was no food for the table for Jonty and his brothers to be sent out rabbit hunting to feed the family. Despite this apparent destitution, the Wilson children never went hungry or unclothed, and they were far from the poorest in the area. Jonty's father, Robert, worked on the farm of the Paget Tomlinsons, 22 shillings a week, approximately £90 in today's money. This was 2 shillings more than the average worker of the period. Jonty was educated at the National School in Kirkby Lonsdale. Children during this period left school when they'd attained Standard 6, which set a minimum standard for reading, writing and arithmetic. This usually meant that they left school between 12 and 14. Jonty, who by his own account had a reasonable record at school, thought that aged 13 he might be destined for the grammar school. It was not to be, however. At age 13, Jonty's father decided that he should be a smith. The smiths were never out of work and didn't have to stop work in bad weather. Many years later, after the death of Jonty's mother, he would find he did actually have the opportunity to go to the grammar school. Unfortunately, it was decided by his parents that the family could not do without the 2 shillings and sixpence that he would make from working. So, in 1907, like 3 of his uncles, Jonty Wilson started work as a smith. His first workplace was the smithy on the Underley estate. Every morning, he had to walk 1.5 miles to get to work, and he had to be there by 6 a.m. ready to start. As an apprentice smith, Jonty spent most of his day pumping the massive forge bellows and watching the other smiths work to learn their trade. The closest he got to working the iron was striking, where he would swing a sledgehammer under the direction of a more experienced smith. By the end of the day, 6 p.m, he would make the return 1.5 mile journey home. In winter, he barely saw sunlight, except on Saturdays, of course, where he got to finish at 1 p.m, a treat. Rural smiths were the kingpins of their community. Without them, farm equipment wasn't repaired, horses weren't shod, and wagons didn't have tyres. They were responsible for keeping the entire rural ecosystem moving. It was this work that kept Jonty busy on all those wet days that his father was oh so worried about. Even as Jonty grew in skill and learnt his trade, he was already looking for ways to diversify. He became a fell runner for the prize money. He also took up the new technology of photography. He converted a room in his house into a dark room and even washed the prints in a stream. Jonty continued to strive to improve himself and his circumstances. He moved away from his beloved Lune Valley, first to Hexham to make fittings for steamers. Then he moved to Wakefield as a toolmaker. He was developing himself, broadening his horizons. Unfortunately, this positive trajectory he was building would not last, as a black cloud rolled in over Europe, bringing the advent of the First World War. As early as 1908, Jonty had joined the Territorials, where he would rise to the rank of corporal. Later, due to his skill as a farrier and work with horses, he would also be invited to join the Westmoreland and Cumberland Yeomanry. It's of little surprise then that when war was announced, he was destined for France. On that fateful day, the 4th of August 1914, Jonty had been running 2 fell races. His brother came to tell him the news and to tell him to report to the drill hall, which he did immediately. He left so quickly, he didn't even collect his winnings. Jonty had a varied career in France. He would start off as a galloper or a mounted messenger, a perfect fit for a man with as much skill and love for horses as he did. Then later, he would become a cartographer, in charge of a small team, mapping out the land, looking for places to put pillboxes, trenches, and small gauge railways. When Jonty returned to Kirkby Lonsdale, his old boss, Mr. Jackson, known locally as Wob, was looking for a successor to inherit Fairbank smithy. Unfortunately, his own son, a skilled blacksmith in his own right, had been killed in the Great War. He thought, therefore, that Jonty would be the perfect man for the job, and thus Jonty came into possession of the smithy in which he would work for the rest of his life. For his first few years in charge of the smithy, there was work to be done. Potentially not as much work as there had been before, but he managed to employ 2 men and they were far from idle. As time marched on into the 1930s, however, the decline of the village smith grew even more acute, along with a lot of other rural crafts. As transportation and agriculture moved away from horses, and specialist machinery was fixed by specialist technicians, and the necessities of life could be manufactured cheaper and easier with machines and factories, the need for the village smith evaporated. Most village blacksmiths did not survive this transition, or they had to move away from their traditional manufacturing processes. This meant that apprentices weren't being trained and old skills were dying off. But Jonty managed to find a way through. Jonty, ever adaptable, as shown by his adoption of photography and fell running, decided he would become a riding instructor. His key insight was there are a number of boarding schools in the area which housed children whose families were out in the British colonies. Overseas, riding wasn't just a recreational sport, it was a necessity of life. So, he gathered up a team of 14 horses and reached out to the schools, and they were grateful and decided to support his venture. Becoming a riding instructor alongside working in the forge allowed Jonty to weather the lean years when many did not. He continued in this manner into the 1950s, when the tide began to turn for smiths, or, I suppose more accurately, the decline slowed a little. The public began to understand that despite the efficiency gains and the reduced cost, machines and factories could never fully replace the beauty and quality of handmade ironwork. Renewed interest in raw ironwork meant renewed interest in Jonty. Now, I think he was well prepared for this, given he once described himself as having the gift of the gab, and in every interview I saw with him, the interviewee couldn't help themselves but say how he would never stop talking. Ultimately, this would bring Jonty to the radio. Initially, he began broadcasting as a contributor to the BBC's Countryside magazine programme. Later, this would get him invited to the Women's Institute to give talks about people he'd met and places he'd been. One such example was the Galloway Gate, an old cattle droving route from Scotland which ran through Kirkby Lonsdale. Jonty was fascinated by it, despite the fact that it had mostly fallen out of use by the 1860s. He meticulously constructed the route by interviewing those who remembered it in his youth, and also going through documents and researching. His rides along the Galloway Gate would actually inspire this very video. His broadcasting would get more ambitious. He presented a series on northern rivers. Predictably, the first episode was on his beloved River Lune. The second was on the River Kent. The pinnacle of his broadcasting career came in his ride along the Foss Way. He was joined by 2 riding companions, Nancy Spain and John Peel. Confusingly, not the John Peel of BBC DJ fame. Over the course of the 2-week trip, every night the trio would present a 15-minute programme detailing some landmark or facet of the landscape that they'd found along the way. His riding companions remembered their time with Jonty fondly, amazed at his knowledge of the natural world around him and his ability to go completely off script whenever he fancied. And now for our very own landmark on our trip today. Welcome to Kirkby Lonsdale. Finally. In his later years, Jonty continued to work in the forge, much as he'd always done, up until a few years before his death, aged 87, on the 19th of September 1981. I'd love to tell you about how it was taken over by a new generation of smiths and continues to be in use to this day. Unfortunately, that was only true for a time. Then it became a pottery studio, and now a hairdresser's. But not all hope is lost. Despite the near complete extinction of blacksmithing in the UK in the mid-20th century, Heritage Crafts lists blacksmithing as currently viable, with between 200 and 500 apprentices being trained in the UK right now. I never had the pleasure of meeting Jonty, but from everything that I learned about him from researching for this video, I think this would make him quite happy. On a more local scale, one of the things that I love about being a blacksmith is seeing the ironwork that I've made in use in a community. Well after my name is long forgotten, the things that I've made will still be around doing the jobs that they were meant to do. And while Jonty's name is far from forgotten, hopefully even less so after this video, if you know what to look for, you can see signs of him all around. One such example is this hooping plate, used to light a fire and heat up wagon tyres before fitting them on the wheel. When it was discovered by local historians, it caused a great deal of excitement, since they believed it to be Roman in origin. It was in fact Jonty's old hooping plate. He corrected them on this, and then donated it to Jubilee Park, where it still stands as a bench. Jonty Wilson was such a fascinating character. He survived through a period of massive change and societal upheaval. Throughout it all, even when many others did not, he held on to ironwork. He was resourceful and flexible. Through diversifying his skills and his boundless curiosity for the world around him, he managed to weather the storm. We find ourselves living through another period of extreme social change. The conclusion of this video wasn't going to be about AI, but the more I thought about it, the more I thought it needed to be. Blacksmiths have already seen the devastating effects of what happens when your craft is stripped away from you, purely for cost and efficiency improvements. This fate awaits many more skills and crafts across the world right now. So, the message of Jonty should be this: continue doing what you love, even if others tell you it's inefficient, because someone in the future will care, I promise. Thanks for watching. The main sources that I was using for this video were My Valley, The Life and Times of Jonty Wilson, and a Cumbrian blacksmith, as well as some YouTube interviews with his daughter linked down in the description below. As with any local history project, it can be really difficult to find out specific details. So if you knew Jonty or you know more about him, I'd love to hear from you down in the description below. That's all for today. See you next time.